do. What are those things? And what are they thinking? And why are they thinking it? Now, if you do dream analysis, and this is a tricky thing, because who's to say if your damn analysis is correct, right? It's very difficult to understand that. If you do dream analysis with someone, you generally have them lay out their dream, and then you ask them when they're going through their dream a second time, they lay out their dream and you can kind of get a picture of it. And then they lay out their dream a second time, and as they go through it, every time they mention a detail or a character, you ask them what that reminds them of. And the hypothesis is that the dream is presenting an image or an idea that's associated with a network of ideas, and that if you can expand on the network of ideas as you go through the dream, you can elaborate on the dream, you can expand it upwards, and you can start to see what it might be attempting to put forward. Now, Freud's idea was that the dream knew what it was doing, but that its content was being suppressed and oppressed by an internal censor. So the dream had to be sneaky about what it was saying because it was going to deliver a message that the person didn't want to hear. And that was tied up with his idea of repression. But that's not Jung's idea. See, Jung's idea was different. He said, no. The dream is trying to tell you what it's trying to tell you as clear as it can. That's just the best it can do. And so you could think of the dream, and this is, I believe, the right way to think about it. The dream is the birthplace of thought, the same way that artists are the birthplace of culture. It's exactly the same process. It's that your mind is groping outward to try to comprehend what it has not yet comprehended. And it does that first by trying to map it onto image. And it's doing that in the dream, and it's somewhat incoherent. And well, let's stick with incoherent, because it's not yet a full-fledged thought. It's the birthplace of thought. It's a fantasy about what might be. And then if you can grip the fantasy and share it with other people, then maybe they can elaborate upon it and bring it into being with more clarity than it would be if it merely existed as the precursor of a thought in your imagination. Now, because Jung's idea too was, okay, you think in words. Where the hell do those thoughts come from? Well, they just spring into my head. Well, that's not much of an answer. They just, pop out of the void? Is there some sort of precursor to the development of the ideas? Is there a developmental pathway? So here's an image. This is the Buddha. There's calm water. There's a lotus. The roots go all the way down to the bottom of the lake. It's dark down there. The roots are embedded in the dark substrata at the bottom of the lake. The plant moves upwards towards the light. The water gets lighter and lighter as you move upward with the root. The flower manifests itself on the surface, and the Buddha sits in the middle. That's an image about how ideas develop. They come out from the bottom of reality, and they push themselves up towards the light, and they blast forward, and something emerges as a consequence. That's what that image means. And it's an image. The gold Buddha that's sitting in the middle of the lotus is an image of the perfect person. You could think about the gold Buddha who sits in a triangle as exactly the same thing that's the eye on the top of the pyramid. These are all the same ideas. And what's the idea that's trying to burst forward? How to be in the world. Well, what other idea would burst forward? Because it's the only problem that you really have. Right? How should you manifest yourself properly in the world? It's everyone's question. It's the ultimate question. It's been the ultimate question since the beginning of time. And we've been working out that idea forever. First of all, merely by acting it out, and then by representing the actions, and then by representing the representations, and spiraling all that together. So I started looking developmentally. I thought, okay, maybe these ideas have roots, and this was partly predicated on the observation from Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and so forth, that there did seem to be a necessary pattern in morality. There seemed to be a necessary pattern. And it wasn't arbitrary. It was a representation of the specific mode of human being. And it isn't something that's just imposed on you by your culture. It's not something that's just learned. It's intrinsic in you, and it's manifest in the culture at the same time. And there's a there's a dialogue between those two things, culture and nature, where the idea is embedded, trying to make the proper articulation of that spring forward in each individual. And that's only to say these aren't radical propositions. Your nature strives so that you can manifest yourself properly in the world. Culture strives to aid you in that endeavor. Is there something about that that's of dubious validity? What else would it be doing? Working for your death? Hardly. Working for your destruction? Well, you could see that maybe when culture becomes pathologized, but to the degree that it's able to maintain itself across long periods of time, it obviously has to be striving in some way for your individual manifestation so that you can survive and flourish. So there's a co-creation of the human being going on through nature and through culture, and then perhaps with your own voluntary will participating, whatever the hell that is, something we don't understand at all and are prone to dismiss because of that. So then I learned about Piaget, and Piaget had some very interesting ideas, and I think I've told you already what Piaget was up to. He wasn't a developmental psychologist. He didn't even regard himself as a psychologist. He wanted to reconcile science and religion. That's what he was doing through his entire bloody life, because it drove him crazy when he was an adolescent. And he didn't think that he would be able to survive unless he could bring those two things together. So he's working on the same problem. And so one of the things that Piaget, who was very prone to observation, he was an ethologist of human beings. That's a good way of thinking about it. An ethologist is a scientist who studies animals by watching their behavior rather than studying them under laboratory conditions. And he got very interested in the spontaneous emergence of morality in the play of children. And it was so smart, that idea that, when kids come together and unify themselves towards a particular goal, so in play, that a morality emerges out of that. And that morality, and I've mentioned this before, there's a morality in game 1, there's a morality in game 2, there's a morality in game 3. What's common across all those moralities is a meta-morality. And so the meta-morality emerges from the particular moralities that are embedded in particular cooperative situations. We could say cooperative and competitive situations. You can expand that out biologically to some degree to the idea of the dominance hierarchy, right? Every social animal, and even many animals who aren't social, are embedded in a dominance hierarchy. The dominance hierarchy has a structure, or we couldn't call it a dominance hierarchy. Dominance hierarchy A, B, C, D, E, thousands of them across thousands of years. You extract out from all of them what's central to all of them. That's the pyramid of value. What question do you need answered about the pyramid of value? What's at the top? Because that's the ideal. That's the eye at the top of the pyramid, or the golden Buddha in the Lotus. It's the same thing. It's the same thing as the crucifix, paradoxically enough. And it has to do with something like the voluntary acceptance and therefore transcendence of suffering. It's something like that. These are not arbitrary ideas. They're deeply, that's my case anyways, they're deeply, deeply, deeply rooted in biology and culture. They're as deeply rooted in biology as the dominance hierarchy is rooted in biology. And we already know the answer to that. The dominance hierarchy has been around for 350 million years. It's a long time. You don't get to just brush that off and say, well, morality is some sort of second order cognitive problem. It's like, no, it's not. I mean, I can tell you something about its instantiation in your nervous system. You have a counter at the bottom of your brain that keeps track of where you are in terms of your status. And it bloody well regulates the sensitivity of your emotions. So if you're at the bottom of the hierarchy, barely clinging on to the world, everything overwhelms you. And that's because you're damn near dead. And so everything should overwhelm you. You've got no extra resources. Any more threat, you're sunk. So you become extremely sensitive to negative emotion and maybe also impulsive, so that you grab while the grabbing's good. And if you're nearer the top in the dominance hierarchy and your counter tells you that, then your serotonin levels go up, you're less sensitive to negative emotion, you're less impulsive, you live longer, like everything works in your favor. Your immune system functions better, and you're oriented at least to some degree towards the medium and long-term future. And you can afford that because all hell isn't breaking loose around you all the time. And so then the question is there a way of being that increases the probability that you're going to move up dominance hierarchies? Well, that doesn't seem to be a particularly provocative proposition. Unless you think that it's completely arbitrary and random, and that you can think that if you want, but I don't think there's any evidence for that whatsoever. I mean, we certainly have, even for sexual selection, we impose criteria. They're not random and arbitrary. So, okay, so back to Jung. So what was Jung trying to do? Well, he was trying to see, Jung believed that once we had stopped populating the cosmos with gods, that they went inside. That's a good way of thinking. Well, think about it this way. You know, an archaic person looks at the sky and uses his imagination to populate the sky. What's the sky? Well, it's the constellations. It's the domain of the gods. Well, why? Well, because the gods are what are out there beyond your understanding. Well, that's what you see when you look up at the sky. So you populate the night sky with figures of your imagination. So the gods are the things that you broadcast out of your imagination and see spread over the world. It's like the contents of your unconscious are manifesting themselves when you encounter the unknown. It's exactly what it is. That's exactly how else could it be, right? You're projecting your fantasy onto what you don't understand. That's how you start to cope with what you don't understand. You populate the unknown with deities. Where did they come from? They came from your imagination. Well, what happens when you take them out of the world? Do they disappear? No. They just go back into your imagination. So that's where Jung dug down to find them. That's the same motif as rescuing your dead father or rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. It's the same idea, is that the corpses of the gods inhabit your imagination. So where do you go if you need to revivify them? You go into your imagination. And that's exactly what Jung did. And I mean, this is no secret. If you read Jung, he tells you that's what he did. He tells you that's why he did it. It's not an interpretation on my part. Well, so then the question is, what's down there? Is it just mess and catastrophe? Or is there something in it that's patterned? Well, Jung's proposition was that you rediscover the great archetypes that guide human being by investigating the structure of your imagination. When he thought about the imagination in some sense, at least in part, as a manifestation of your biology. Well, yes. What else would it be? You know, and I told you that story about my nephew, I believe, right? About him running around as a knight and then going off to have a combat with the dwarves and the dragons. It's like, well, where did that come from? Well, partly it came from his culture, right? Because he was a knight, and so obviously that's a cultural construct. But the thing is that his imagination it's this structure that's looking for things to fill itself with. Just like your predisposition to language. You have a predisposition to language. What is that? We don't know. What does it do? It looks for things in the world to fill itself with, right? And if you first of all, when you start to learn how to speak, you babble every phoneme. Did you know that? If I was learning to speak an Asian language, there would be phonemes I couldn't pronounce, and vice versa. An infant, all of them, they babble all the phonemes, and then as they start to learn the language, they lose the ability to say a bunch of them and only retain the ones that are relevant to that language. So a baby babbles all possible languages, that's a way of thinking about it, and then loses the ability. So that's you can see there. So you could say, well, you manifest the potential to be possessed by the set of all possible archetypes. It's built into your biology. And then as you're enculturated in your own culture, the set of archetypes that manifest themselves in that culture are the ones that you pull in for your own use. So my nephew's running around like a knight. Well, you know, if he would have been born in the middle of the Amazon, he would have been running around with a bow and, you know, a poisoned arrow and a bow. It's the same thing. It's the same idea. It's just trapped out in different cultural dress. And his little imagination was trying to solve the problem. How do you deal with the unknown? Well, what's the unknown? It's these little devils that keep jumping up on you and biting you, and they come out without end. So just killing them, it's like cutting the head off the Hydra, right? 7 more grow. Well, what the hell good is it to solve one problem when there's just a bunch more problems that are going to come after you? And that's everyone's question. That's the ultimate question of nihilism, right? Why bother solving a problem if all that's going to happen is that 20 more problems are going to come your way? Why not just give up and die? Well, right, it's a good question. It's a good question, right? Is the suffering so intense that the whole game should just be brought to an end? That's another fundamental question of existence. And people who've become truly malevolent answer that question in the affirmative. They say, it's too much, we should destroy it. Now, I wouldn't say they're precisely doing it only for humanitarian reasons, but you have to understand and appreciate the logic. It's not irrational. That's the other thing. It's not irrational to work for the destruction of being. It's not irrational. In fact, it might be the most rational thing you could come up with. Depends on your initial set of presuppositions. So, Jung, down into the belly of the beast, so to speak, to see what lurks in the imagination. He sees the birthplace of archetypal ideas. Well, what are archetypal ideas? They're patterns of, you could think about them as representations of patterns of adaptive behavior. And so then you might ask, well, where did they come from? Well, that's part of what I've been trying to teach you about. They evolved, as far as I can tell, right? They evolved collectively, is that our society, and this is the dominance hierarchy idea. Dominance hierarchies set themselves up as a matter of course. They're the standard way that animals organize themselves in a territory. Well, okay, human beings are watching those dominance hierarchies since we became self-aware, thinking, what the hell are we up to? What the hell are we up to? And there's a question that lurks in there. What constitutes acceptable power? What constitutes acceptable sovereignty? Who should lead? Who should rule? What should be at the top? Well, we talked about that. The Mesopotamians figured that out. Speech and vision, that's Marduk. Speech, vision, and the willingness to confront the terrible unknown. That's what should rule. Well, what? Is that an arbitrary idea or is that a great idea? How could it be any other way? Well, that's what human beings are like. And I don't think that you can read the Mesopotamian story and understand the reference, which isn't an easy thing to do, and fail to draw that conclusion. Marduk has eyes all the way around his head. He speaks magic words. He goes off to fight Tiamat, the dragon of chaos. Well, what's that? That's the reptilian predator that lurks in the unknown. Well, is any of that, is there anything about any of that that stands in opposition to what you would presume if you were just analyzing our situation from a purely biological perspective? We're prey animals, we're predators. We've been threatened by reptiles forever. Why wouldn't we use the predator that lurks in the dark forest or the water as a representative of the unknown? Why wouldn't we harness that circuitry? We already have it at hand. And even more to the point, how could we do anything else? It makes perfect sense. Well, so then you might say, well, what would you want to be king? You could say king of the world or king of your own soul. What do you want to subordinate yourself to? How about your heroic willingness to encounter the unknown and articulate it and share that with people? There's no nobler vision than that. And I don't see that it's merely arbitrary. And it's not merely arbitrary too, because if you do that, to the degree that you do that, assuming your society isn't entirely corrupt, you will be successful. It will actually aid you practically. You'll rise up above men. You'll be selected by women. You'll be admirable. You'll be valued. And you know that because if you look at the people that you admire and value, again, unless you've taken a detour into dark places and are possessed with admiration for people who are working for malevolent purposes and for destruction, you just have to watch the people that you admire and try to figure out what's common across them and draw your own conclusions. And you can ask yourself too, when you're torturing yourself with your conscience because you're not doing what you should be and you know it, what is it that you're torturing yourself in relationship to? You have a vision of your own ideal and you torment yourself if you're not matching it. What's the ideal? Well, you don't know, right? It's kind of incoherent and poorly articulated, but that doesn't mean it isn't trying to manifest itself and make itself known to you. It's really the purpose of religious education, is to make that ideal articulated. Well, we've lost that. It's not a good thing. Okay, so I talked to you about the Mesopotamian story. And I talked to you about the Egyptian story and what I thought it meant. And it's a bit of an elaboration on the same theme, because it says, well, the hero isn't only the deity, the transcendent pattern, let's say, that goes out into the unknown, cuts it into pieces, and makes the world. That's not good enough, because it only deals with the terrible mother. That's one way of thinking about it. But there's a terrible father too, once culture gets instantiated in large scale. And the Egyptians had that problem. Two problems. Chaos. Second problem, pathological order. Well, structures tend towards pathological order. The Egyptians laid out why. That's Seth, right? Seth is the evil advisor of the king who's lurking in the background all the time, trying to tear the structure down for his own malevolent purposes. So now and then that overcomes the structure and destroys rigidifies and makes malevolent the entire social structure. So it degenerates into, say, fascist totalitarianism, something like that. And that's been a threat since we've had highly organized societies. Then the hero ends up in the underworld and has to come back and do direct combat with that malevolent force at the price of his own consciousness, right? Because Horus gets one of his eyes destroyed. It's no bloody joke to face the forces that make a culture rigid and malevolent. So there's an addition to the hero archetype. Two things happen. One, you go out and you conquer chaos and you make order out of it. But the second is you take pathological order, recast it into chaos, and then allow it to reemerge. And you do that not in some arbitrary sense, but in tandem with your rescued father. And that's, I guess, in part what Nietzsche missed, as far as I can tell, is he knew of the death of God. Perhaps he didn't know that it had happened many times. Mircea Eliade documented that across many cultures. But what Nietzsche didn't seem to lay out, at least in his vision of the Superman or the Overman, was that it was a responsibility of the person who wants to revivify the culture to go down and rescue the damn culture, which is what you're supposed to be doing in university, because your father is lying dead in the libraries, right? So you're supposed to be going in there and taking that spirit out of the books and manifesting it in your own being. That's what the universities were for, although I don't think that's what they're for anymore. So we talked about the Mesopotamian story, and we talked about the Egyptian story, and other people have documented the emergence of hero mythology in cultures far more diverse than the ones that I'm exposing you to. That was done most popularly by Joseph Campbell. But I don't think Campbell had a single idea that he didn't derive from Jung. And I'm not saying that in a critical manner, because Campbell was good at standing as a mediator between Jung and a more general population. He did, and that's a non-trivial accomplishment, seriously. But Jung is still the source of those ideas, and if you're serious about them, that's the person that you have to go to for that kind of knowledge. So now I wanted to tell you some other stories that are in some sense closer to Western culture. They're the stories upon which Western culture is actually predicated. So I'm going to tell you, I'm not only Western story today, I'm going to tell you a couple of stories from Genesis, and I'm going to tell you about the story of the Buddha. I'm going to do that at the same time, because the story of the Buddha is almost a perfect parallel, structurally speaking, to the story of Adam and Eve. And so I want to show you that, and you can decide for yourself if I'm imposing a pattern on it, because God only knows, right? Or whether or not, once you have the key to understanding the stories, which I hope I provided you with the, the idea of the dragon of chaos and the great mother and the great father and the individual, it gives you a schema that you can use to understand the characterizations of great stories. And as far as I can tell, it works pretty much universally across stories. So I want to walk you through those foundational stories. And I would say, one of the things to know about the way the Bible is structured, there's a couple of things you want to know about it, is that it was authored by multiple people across extraordinarily vast spans of time, and then aggregated by other people and sorted into something that seemed to make sense. And so you can really think about it because Bible is a library. It's a library of books. It's not a book. The library is organized a certain way that makes a kind of sense, but it's not exactly as if anyone decided what that sense would be. It's the collaborative work of hundreds and thousands of people across thousands of years attempting to organize a collective story into something out of which the sense emerges. It's like human beings acted, and then they dreamed about how they acted, and then they wrote down what they dreamed about how they acted, and then they organized what they wrote about how they dreamed they acted. And that's how that book came into being. And the information that's within it emerged from the behavioral level upward, right? Rather than being imposed top down. Now there's a feedback, right? Because if you understand how you act, then that changes how you act. And so you can't avoid the top-down feedback, but a tremendous amount of the information in there, and this is why it's revelatory information, we don't know. It's in there because how we act is informative. And then if you represent how we act, that's informative. But the information came from how we act, not from the representation of how we act. And then you might think, well, how did we learn how to act? And the answer is, we've been trying to figure out how to do that for 3.5 billion years. There's lots of information encoded in our actions and in our social interactions, way more than we understand. So we're acting something out. We don't understand what it is, but we're doing our best to pull that information upward, partly by dreaming about it. That's what you're doing at night. You're trying to figure out what the hell you're up to. Well, you don't know because you don't know yourself in totality. How could you possibly know? Best you can do is dream yourself up and then speak yourself into some sort of articulated existence. It's just an approximation because whatever you are rapidly supersedes whatever you think you are. That's why people constantly shock themselves, you know. If you were only what you thought of yourself, well, wouldn't life be simple? You'd know exactly what you were doing all the time, and you could even control your own behavior. Well, good luck with that. You can't do that for yourself, much less for other people. So let's go through these stories. So they're sequenced. People are trying to make sense out of them. They're aggregating these stories from all sorts of different places, all sorts of different tribes, all sorts of different times, and then trying to make them coherent without losing the content and without doing arbitrary editing. And so part of the reason that the Bible is full of internal contradictions is for the same reason that a dream is full of internal contradictions. Is if you impose too much coherence on it, you start losing the... Look, imagine that you have a impressionist painting. Well, it's messy and the image emerges, and you might say, well, we could replace that with a nice clean line drawing or even a sequence of stick figures and get the basic point across. It's like, well, you would, but you'd lose the richness. The unarticulable richness would be lost in the premature attempt to bring logical closure to the phenomena. And so, in fact, we know already that that's maybe the difference between dreams and waking thought. So, waking thought sacrifices completeness for coherence, right? So, whereas dream thought sacrifices coherence for completeness. And that's not something I'm saying arbitrarily. This is something that has been thought through by people who've been thinking this sort of thing through for a long time. Precise thought excludes too much. An imprecise thought is not sufficiently coherent. So we do both. Precise thought, left hemisphere, linguistically mediated, sequential, logical. Incoherent but complete thought, imagistic, emotion-based, right hemisphere. The right hemisphere even has a more diffuse structure. It's like the right hemisphere is trying to get a picture of everything. Now, it's not going to be a very detailed picture because it's a picture of everything, full of contradictions. But at least it's a picture of everything. And the left says that's not good enough for precise action. And it's not. So we'll narrow that to precision. But we lose the richness. But you need both. So there's an interplay. Well, the documents that the Bible is composed of are half dream and half articulated thought. And they have the advantages of articulated thought and the advantages of the dream, but also the disadvantages of both. So it's to the degree that it's articulated, it's in a dogmatic box. To the degree that it's a dream, it's still incoherent. But the problem is you have to move through the entire world even though you don't know it in detail. So you need detailed knowledge where detailed knowledge is necessary, and you need vague but complete knowledge where that's necessary. It's a very uncomfortable balance, but we have to face everything even though we don't understand anything completely. Now, Genesis, the first stories in Genesis are, what would you say? Unidentifiably ancient. God only knows how old they are. The story of Noah, here's an interesting thing. I know this guy he's a Kwakwaka'wakw tribal member and an artist who lives on the tip of of Vancouver Island. And the culture he comes from is about 14,000 years old, something like that. And